So you're Henry Weinfield, distinguished poet, distinguished translator of other poets. I have to admit that I first got to know you through your translations, and only secondarily when I discovered that your own poetry was very much to my liking. But I think my first experience of your work was your translation of Mallarmé. And to prove that I'm a long-time reader, I went this morning through the books I have here to see which of your. Well, let me start with the translations. It's the Mallarmé. Old cover, you can see it's getting a bit worn. Your Hesiod, done with is it Catherine Schlegel? Yeah,
yes.
Catherine Schlegel. Yeah. Yes. I have your Chimeras, your Gerard de Nerval. I have it twice, and your, we say, magnificent recent translation of Ronsard, The Labyrinth of Love. I want to talk about all of these things, but then also, let's see. You sent me this. That was sort of your collected verse up to when? About
2008.
2008. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Plenty of other. I even have this chapbook.
Oh
yeah. And your most recent works of your own verse, As the Crow Flies and An Alphabet.
Yes.
This is all shameless advertising at the moment.
Why not?
But it is good to see you, and it's good to talk. And I am a genuine admirer. I actually, not just an admirer, an envier in a sense, because translation is hard. Translation that does justice to the original is especially hard. And translation that does justice to great poets is almost impossible, and yet you seem to pull it off with shocking facility.
Thank you. Although the Ronsard was at least 10 years, so I wouldn't exactly call that facility.
Well, I said seem to. Yeah, I mean, well, making it look easy is part of part of the secret of any art, I guess. But nonetheless, Ronsard, especially, I suppose, is on my mind now because it's the most recent translation. But I have to say, I mean, I think I told you this once, I think some years ago, that might have been when we first met, that I had actually contemplated translating Ronsard.
Yes.
And there's a funny story about this. And I had hung back thinking, you know, he was a lyric poet of extraordinary gifts, very, though, rigorous in form, you know, an absolute virtuoso. And, you know, I've always thought that there's no point in attempting a translation like that unless you can actually produce something other than mere competent verse. You actually have to produce poetry. Otherwise, you might as well just do the sort of the Penguin classics, just do a gloss at the bottom of the page.
Right.
And I don't know if I really felt equal to it, because on the one hand, it's not that I doubt that I have a way with words. I just doubt that I would be able to walk that fine line between fidelity and felicity well enough to render Ronsard into really good English poetry. But you've done it with, and it's not the first time you've pulled it off, but I mean, you've done it for, and I should, you know, point out, this is a over 200 pages worth of his verse. I mean, with facing pages, so a good 100 pages translations, and I you know, I'm honestly envious.
Well, that's very kind of you, David. I'm really interested in the fact that you wanted to do it yourself, and also that you wanted to do the Marie poems. You told me.
I do. Yeah.
Could you tell me why you were especially drawn to the Marie poems and to Ronsard?
Well, with Ronsard, the appeal in part was just, in large part, just, I mean, this is simply a truly great poet, too little known in the Anglophone world. The Marie for those who don't know, he had a tendency sort of to become enamored of one mistress or another, and devote a cycle of poetry to her, and then there is a different tonality in these differing cycles, and I think the Marie poems were the first I came to know. I had this. It was a little. I can't even remember the press. It might have been an early Gallimard. It was just the Marie poems. I think that was the first I ever read in the French, and I became enchanted with them. So that's why I chose them. I might have changed. I might have tried a more general selection had I gotten into it. But the funny thing is, believe it or not, it was that project that actually yielded the New Testament translation I ended up doing. It seems implausible, but I was, I just thought I might like to do some translation work in addition to my writing. This is when I was, I don't know, this is probably maybe 2010 or 2011. And I got in touch with, I have this wonderful editor at Yale named Jennifer Banks. And I suggested to her, there were two translation projects I'd considered. On the side of lyric poem, I was thinking Ronsard. But then I also thought I might like to do a version of Quintus of Smyrna's Post to America. This shows you how good my sense of markets is. Because, of course, I don't really think that they're actually lining the pavements for either of those things. And she said, oh, well, you consider that, but that they had two translation projects that they were looking for someone else to do. One was Lucretius and one was the New Testament. And I immediately thought I'd do Lucretius. But then I realized, of course, that I'd been translating the New Testament in classrooms for years by correcting the things I'd had, the versions that were being read. So that's how that ended up. So Ronsard somehow led to the New Testament. But anyway, why did you choose Ronsard, since you actually did the translation work that I only dreamt about?
Not because he led to the New Testament. To tell you the truth.
It seems like such a natural linkage.
I just, I guess I started to read him seriously. I mean, I think the first through Yeats, that when you're old and gray and full of sleep, that imitation that Yeats did.
Right.
And then I somewhere along the line, I don't even remember, to tell you the truth, I started to read him in French, and I just sort of fell in love with it.
Yeah.
Such a beautiful poet, and it felt that there's something that happens with translation with me where I can do it with some poets, and I can't do it with other poets. So I was able to do it with Mallarmé, who's maybe the most difficult poet in French. And then there are other poets I simply could not do it with, but I just sort of fell in love with Ronsard. The first one I did was one of the Hélène poems, a very famous poem, Quand vous serez bien vieille au soir à la chandelle. I did that one, that very famous one.
Yeah, it's probably the most famous.
Yeah, that's one of the most famous poems in French poetry, and that sort of got me into it. And gradually, I never set out to do something. It just always sort of happens.
Forgive me, I have to adjust my chair. For some reason, it seems to be on time. So I'm going to pause.
Okay.
There we go. Well, I mean, I should say, I mean, your Mallarmé, of course, I think is easily, well, for one thing, it's comprehensive, but it's also the standard in English. And to be honest, when I mean, as I say, I've had it for many years. I came across it when it was first released, which was, what year was that?
1995, I think.
Yeah,
94,
94, yeah. And I just thought that this was about as perfect a rendering as one could hope for. And Mallarmé, of course, as you say, is very difficult. I mean, he's oblique for one thing to begin with, but again, there's that extraordinary virtuosity that you do not want to lose in rendering into English, and so I'm a great admirer of that translation as well. So I could go on praising you all day, I suppose, but it'd be a little bit on the tedious side after a while for you. But I'll say this: I'm glad I didn't do the Ronsard translation now. It wouldn't have been as good, and I would have seen only its flaws anyway. And with the New Testament, there was no pressure to be no pressure to perform at the level of the verse I was trying to translate. The purpose of the New Testament translation was just to try to be accurate about things that are generally hidden from view by normal translations. Now, I get a lot more hatred as a result. I mean, I don't think I would have invited.
Ronsard would have generated as much.
Right. There just aren't as many passions on these.
Right. Yeah.
I don't want to dwell just on the translations. I want to talk about your verse and other things we've talked about in the past. But, when you translate, I'm just as curious to me. I mean, when you translate, is the experience for you much the same as being a poet in your own right, or is it a radically different sort of creative experience? I know that seems like a very vague question.
Not really. The technique is, in a way, the same. It's actually more difficult because the original is already there. So what one has to do is to reach the original in some way. But I feel there's some way in which it's both my voice and the poet's voice. So, but I'm not really very good at talking about translation. I've written one essay on it, but it's a very different kind of process in the sense that translation doesn't involve invention, right? It doesn't involve invention, but it involves technique, and that's so you start out at a different place, put it that way. But in the end, I want to satisfy myself in exactly the same way that I want to satisfy myself with my own verse.
I find it hard to talk about any number of things about writing, so I understand that. But it's I mean, nonetheless, I mean, there are. It just seems to me there are certain points when I read your translations where. Let me explain why I say this. I mean, the things I admire are when French verse, for instance. I mean, this is what you do principally. Actually becomes English poetry because I was in one of the love poems for Mary. 67. There's in the third and fourth lines are votre beauté, bouquet du bouquet, la fleur des fleurs, la rose de la rose, which you make your beauty as its own best accolade, the flower of flowers, the quintessential rose. Now that may be just a matter of technique for you, but to me it's a matter of considerable art. For the simple reason that in French, a line like le fleur des fleurs, la rose de la rose, an unstressed language, it works in French. It would be dead in English. It just would. Whereas the flower of flowers, also the quintessential rose, that change is a change from, for one thing, it scans, but I mean, it becomes at that point genuinely English verse. It's not simply a rendering, and to me, even a little touch like that is an impressive and admirable thing, and it does make me believe. I mean, the old saying, not that old. I'm trying to remember who said, was it Frost? Poetry is what gets lost in translation.
Yeah,
is so often true. But you can get positively Nabokovian about this and do there's no way to appreciate the poem except in the original language. So produce something like his Onegin, right. Which kind of defeats the purpose of reading poetry at all.
Right.
Whereas you convince me that it is possible. Now, happily, I read French too. So, but we're at a language I didn't read. I mean, it convinces me that poetry is not simply what's lost. It's obvious that what you're producing is an analogy, in a sense, of the original. You can't, it's not.
Well, actually, you pointed out these two lines. I'm very proud of them. So here I do feel that I arrived at something in English poetry that's analogous to the French. So I'm very proud of the word accolade.
Yeah.
And the way it works with the Petrarchan form.
Right.
By the way, in terms of the form, I don't always do it in Petrarchan as a Petrarchan form, because sometimes it would just be too much straining. But here it seemed to work. And I like the quintessential rose. I'm glad you pointed that out, because I feel I was proud of that.
And you need that comma there, to be honest. I mean, yes. Curiously, Yeah, no, I'm glad. Well, you see, you should be proud of it, and it struck my ear immediately. I just. I'm not going to go on and on about it, but I mean, I find it encouraging as a reader. So anyway, more about you.
Would you like me to read? You wanted me to read, David, the last of the ones on the death of Marie,
right?
Which is one of the most famous poems in French poetry.
Yeah.
And I thought I would read 67, which you started to talk about as well, because he treats the rose symbol in a totally different way.
Yeah, no, I would love it.
Platonic. So maybe I'll read both of them if you like, and we can talk about them if you like, or we can just go on.
Yes, please. Okay. We want to start with 67 then?
Okay.
Okay.
For you in vain this garland I compose, for you in vain my goddess is it made. Your beauty is its own best accolade, the flower of flowers, the quintessential rose. The one way that you differ from all those flowers is that in winter they're unmade. Your spring of perfect bloom is not afraid of any changes that the years impose. Happy bouquet, you should not ever come to this fair breast where love has made its home, or touch the twin ripe apples that are there. Your brilliant luster would soon fade away, your freshness wither, subject to decay, as I have withered out of love for her.
Yeah. I think that's a masterful rendering. I mean, I can see the decisions you've made, and again, you have it facing the French. In fact, I like "Et à verdure sans grâce périgoire," becoming a freshness wither, subject to decay, because that's an almost impossible line to render directly. I mean, how long do you have to labor over that, though?
Well, I don't remember.
I mean, just in general. I mean,
if I worked all day and managed to get one translation, I would call it a good day.
Yeah.
Often it would take me a lot longer, and I filled up notebooks and so on. It's not easy. It's not easy, and there are certain things that Ronsard does that that I just adore. For example, line 10, ce beau logis d'amour, this where love has made its home.
Yeah.
I think it's so beautiful. So,
Beau logis d'amour.
yeah. So yeah. I mean, they often took a long time, and then sometimes things fell into place more easily. But this one I think took quite a while.
And so, well, let's go right to the. I mean, for those again who are not familiar with, and I'm assuming that many listeners aren't. I mean, the Ronsard craze is yet to come. I know, but comme on voit sur la branche moi de la rose. Actually, it's the first Marie. It's a funny thing. I read them backwards. As it was the first Marie poem I ever read, so I was starting posthumously in a sense. But if you could read, this is the you know, this is actually, for those who don't know, again, this is the last of the poems, a set of four, if I recall, that he wrote after Marie had died, and
much later than the other.
Much later. But go on, if you would.
Okay. All right. Just as one sees the rose on its stem in May, in youthful beauty, in its earliest flower, making sky jealous of its vibrant color, by dawn's tears watered at the break of day. Grace in each fold and love in full display, embalming the gardens and the trees with odor. But beaten by rain or by excessive ardor, languish and die till fold upon fold falls away. So in the earliest newness of your youth, your beauty honored both by heaven and earth, fate cut you off, and now your dust reposes. For obsequy, receive from me these tears, this bowl of milk, this basket full of flowers, so that alive and dead you are not but roses.
Yeah. Again, I mean, and as I say, I would say before, it does justice to the original, which is hard to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There are a number of things in this poem that I just think are amazing. And it probably is hard to hear them just when you're listening on a YouTube. By dawn's tears watered at the break of day, tears, quand l'aube de ses pleurs au point du jour la rose. There are two things. So there's proleptic qualities, so that the dew of the dawn is watering, is watering the rose, but he has the tears because it's proleptically aware of the death of the rose in advance. So I think that's a beautiful touch. And then the strange homonymic rhyme, and this was actually very important for Mallarmé many years later, and the modernists. So you have the first line, la rose, the rose, and then the fourth line, of course, translation can't do this at all. Fourth line, la rose, L apostrophe ARROSE, waters it.
Yeah.
So, and it's just such a beautiful rhyme. And there's almost kind of mysticism in his attitude toward rhymes that I find very beautiful. And then the other thing that really knocks me out, ciel, of course, in French means either sky or heaven, or both at once. And that is in line 10, quand la terre et le ciel honoraient ta beauté, when the earth and sky or heaven honored your beauty. In my translation, your beauty honored both by heaven and earth. I find something almost miraculous in that line, that both heaven and earth is honoring the beauty of the rose. There's something so, to me, moving about that. I find it hard to explain why, but
well, I don't know.
there's a transcendental dimension to it, right?
Yeah.
With heaven, it's not only an earthly thing, but something that goes beyond the earth. That's a heavenly thing. But yet it can't be protected, because then fate cut you off. And for Ronsard, he uses la parc,
Yeah.
the parcai in Latin, the moirai in Greek, the fates, right? Fate
Yeah.
cut you off. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that you talk about I think that's something that runs through Ronsard, right? I mean, I don't know how to describe it either. This is the problem, of course, is if one could describe it particularly well, it wouldn't really be, there'd be no reason for it to be expressed in verse, right? I mean,
Right.
Poetry isn't just what's lost in translation. Poetry is what captures what's lost in everyday discourse. But there is, as Ronsard, this wonderful sort of merging of the heavenly and the earthly, in the sense that he never departs from the concrete, the earthly, the particular very far, but he doesn't manage again and again to infuse it with mystery, and
Yeah.
beauty. And I don't mean a ponderous mystery. I just mean that is just part of his poetic genius, is that he can charge an image of the rose being adored by heaven and earth with a kind of ineffable surfeit of meaning. And I mean, I don't have high hopes, craze for Ronsard in the English-speaking world. I doubt if his star is particularly at its height in the Francophone world, because I saw some rather disturbing statistics about literacy in France just the other day, and the degree to which the classical canon, which, I mean, just for sheer richness, there's nothing else that quite matches the French literary canon. But whatever else I'll say about this book, and then we'll move on, is I'm grateful also because I think it does make a singular contribution to the appreciation of a great poet in the French tradition, little known in the English. And there certainly hasn't been. I mean, let's be honest. A lot of the translations of Ronsard that you could find in old anthologies are kind of an Edwardian stodginess to them. That thankfully your translation is free of. So your own first book of verse, actually, your verse. No.
It was called The Carnival Cantata, and it was published in 1971 by Unicorn Press. So it was a year out. I was a year out of undergraduate school, and it's mainly juvenilia now, I feel. But
Any happy
I feel that I came into my maturity somehow with the sonnets elegiac and satirical, which originally was published as a chapbook in 1982, so a little bit later.
Right.
And those sonnets are in between Shakespearean and Spenserian form. And then, so actually, I think I began as a young poet, sort of under the sway of modernism and not using rhyme and not using meter. And then, oddly enough, I went back to it, sort of under the pressure of emotional experiences and various other experiences. And that was sort of my real beginnings, I think. And then I published a book called The Sorrows of Eros. So I was already at Notre Dame in 1999. That's still available from the University of Notre Dame Press, and so on.
Well, I mean, it's not a unique story being under the sway of modernism and moving back towards a more formalist idiom. I mean, it's funny though. You say emotional experiences. It's curious. I was just reading an old. Do you know the American composer John Harbison?
Very little.
Yeah, was a wonderful composer. Actually, among other things, his ballet, The Odyssey, is the finest long ballet score I think that an American composer ever produced. But he, of course, started in the idiom of a sort of high modernism as well, in musical terms. It was actually, in his case, the death of a child that made him, want to, in a sense, return, not slavishly, but to return to tonality and the tone, because he found himself confined expressively if he wasn't allowed to employ formal technique. He found that in some ways the pressure il faut moderniser, always to be modernizing, was confining to him expressively.
I think that's the case. I mean, somehow I felt that in those sonnets, I needed access to a more traditional idiom and form that would give me the expressivity I wanted.
Also,
I'll take a look at. I'll listen to the John Harbison.
We should. It's fascinating. I mean, you listen to it. I mean, it was all very accomplished. Don't get me wrong. I mean, but one can see that very early in his career, he'd kind of reached the limit of what he could do in the then dominant. And he took a lot of abuse, as did many composers who trod the same path, for wanting to recover what he could from the past and use it all fruitfully, bring it into the present. It's not just but I'll say this about your verse, is it's not just that has it does have a real expressive power. I find you're obviously a very proficient formalist poet when you choose to be. Also, though, I have to say, it also has a kind of aphoristic concision that I like. I mean, there are moments of bitterness and irony in your verse, that I think work especially well because of the formal mastery.
I don't like to think of myself as a formalist.
Because I was careful. I said you're as formalist as you choose to be.
Right. Formalism implies that there's an a priori form.
Right.
That can be a kind of Procrustean bed.
Yeah.
And I don't work that way. I feel that form has to be organic to content in some way.
Yeah, I was trying to phrase it carefully, not to give because I can find, I find, I mean, there are those who devote themselves to formalism as a philosophy, and you end up quite often with fairly arid prettiness sometimes, but not, no. But the point I'm trying to make, though, is the use of more rhyme and meter of a traditional kind of structure of a sonnet or whatever. It gives a kind of controlled power to some of, as I say, some of the well, I mean, I'm trying to remember the poem of yours that ends speaking of the God to whom the Jews prayed throughout the year, and he never came. Right? Can you remember which poem that is? The last line.
And though they prayed to him, he never came. That's I think one of the sonnets. Can I run over and get something?
Oh, yeah.
It begins the early Christians. It's from the sonnets elegiac and satirical, so it's a very old poem. The early Christians were so confident that they could reconcile opposing views. They turned the lamp that lit the Occident upon the darker wisdom of the Jews. Their concept was that God could interfuse the entire universe with his sole plan. omniscient and omnipotent, could choose miraculously to become a man. But men are murderers in all their art, the skin-stretched lampshade of idolatry. This bitter knowledge set the Jews apart through all their wanderings through history. Their God was imageless, he had no name, and though they prayed to him, he never came.
Yeah. To me, and you say like in satirical in the title there, but I mean the truth is, I mean there is the power of that poem in part is possible only because of the strict formal perfection. It renders. I mean, it creates a kind of emotional distance in one sense. I mean, it's not rapturously, formlessly expressive. It's not just anger. It's not just bleak commentary, and so what I find impressive, say, in that poem is the economy and the rigors of the form enhance the power of the sentiment and the commentary 1,000-fold. It just, without question, it comes as a more brutally perfect and piercing line at the end because of how you've gotten there.
Thanks very much.
Well,
that's exactly what I would want. I would have want people to get from that poem. So.
Well, there are a lot of moments like that in your verse. I talk about its formal graces. I mean, it is really. I mean, one can read your poetry for pleasure, without question. I mean, it is quite often beautifully accomplished. But there are a lot of bleak moments. There's a lot of commentary like that in it too that brings one up short, and is ever so much more effective than if it were just the expression of a sentiment, because it's emotionally contained and artistically contained within that form, within that formal gracefulness and that formal rigor. So. I thought your most recent poems, your most recent poems of your own, your most recent volumes are As the Crow Flies and An Alphabet. In fact, I think I'm one of the recommenders of An Alphabet on the back. I believe I asked if you could also read from it.
Yes.
A couple poems of your choosing.
Yeah. And by the way, I really cherish the little comment that you make on the back of that book. It's exactly what I would hope people would think. So
well, let me read it out, because I'm better expressing my admiration for the verse on paper than I'm impromptu. Again, the title of the book is An Alphabet, and the poems actually are poems arranged according to the letters of the alphabet, An alphabet, yes, but also something of a grammar, exhibiting the rules of lyric poetry at its best as both craft and art. Everything one expects from Weinfield's verses here: the formal perfection, the ingenious wit, which is very important, the tenderness, the elegance, the deep intelligence, and of course the very real beauty. And I meant all that. So
yeah, I'm very grateful to you. So I thought I would read I, not to sound like Martin Buber, but I'd read I and You.
Okay.
Both of which are short.
Okay.
So, and you see a little bit of what I'm doing in this book. So here's I. I spy with my little eye late summer leaves still green against the sky, young mothers with their babies passing by, girls in their girlhood playing happily. I spy with my little eye as if I were God's designated spy, the ordinary stuff of comedy, or else, too frequently, of tragedy. Lives wasted and weighed down by poverty, others buoyed up somehow in dignity. The young, the middle-aged, the elderly, some new to life and others soon to die. I spy with my little eye, which only sees the things that it can see and only spies the things that it can spy, blind to all else by sad necessity, beyond its given singularity. My little eye formed by a little eye, my little eye formed by a little eye.
Yeah, and typographically, it's my little eye, as in ego, formed by a little eye, the eye in the head.
Yeah. First, my little eye, EYE, formed by a little eye.
Yeah.
And my little eye formed. Then it's chiastically reversed.
Right.
Chiasmus. So, yeah.
And if you go ahead and read you as well.
Okay. You. You being singular and plural too, embraces multitudes, but even so can be one only. Only one is two. Whom you address is you, and as things go, you are the one whom you are talking to. I is another, said Arthur Rimbaud. I is another, maybe more than few. Talk to yourselves and find out what they know. Acquaint yourself with others who are you.
So why do you choose those two out of curiosity? Just because it's I and you, or?
I don't know. I mean, they're not even my favorites. I just thought we should go with short ones probably. And I don't know. I mean, I have I think maybe my favorite is L in some ways, but.
Well, you know, oh yeah, well, actually, if it's not too much trouble, I'd actually ask you to read that one too. It's longer, it's true, and there's a play on the letter L and the name of God, L.
Yes. Okay.
And it is definitely, again, it as I said, there are those hard moments in your verse that shine all the more because of the formal structure. This is a perfect example, but it's also L, E-L-L, the E, French for, she. And so.
There are actually three L's in this one. The first one is E-L-L-E.
Yeah.
Then there's E-L, one of the old names for God. And then there's the L train, subway train.
Right. Okay. Yes, I forgot that. Yeah.
So, all right. L. L. Not El, the jealous God of Israel, who overthrew the Ugaritic bell, insisting, as they all do, he was all, and made us want so much and made us small. Not El, the jealous God of Israel, who gave us heaven and who gave us hell. El, not El, the jealous God of Israel, who plural transformed multiplicity into a fraudulent unicity. The Elohim from many he made one. The choice before us now was all or none, either transcendence or the dark abyss of nothingness, eternal pain or bliss. Nor could the bliss that was proposed appeal to anything the senses could deem real. Not El, the jealous God of Israel, who tempted us until at last we fell. El, not El, the jealous God of Israel. Morality he gave us, this is true. It was the least or most that he could do. Morality bred arrogance and strife. It made us hate our bodies and hate life. It fostered cruelty and oftentimes elicited our most egregious crimes. Not El, the jealous God of Israel, who tortured Job for reasons hard to tell. Not El, but El, das ewig Weibliche, La Belle, with whom I rode the Bronx-bound Broadway L that morning when we both were 17. Those were my salad days when I was green. And when at last she finally let me in, I knew her for the eternal feminine. Not El, the jealous god of Israel, who overthrew the Ugaritic bell, but El, das ewig weibliche, La Belle.
Now, one could plausibly say there's a touch of anger in there, but certainly, you know,
a little bit.
And also,
I was reminded
the tenderness at the end. You know, I mean, it is you know, the ewig weibliche, you know, the La Belle. Ewig weibliche by itself, of course, might be a little bit too sublime and grand on its own, but there where the eternal feminine becomes La Belle, you know, the sort of the bliss of this world, this life, you know, the tender encounter on the L, which comes across in the poem as holier than the L who overthrew Ugaritic Bell.
Yeah. You know, I don't know if you want to get into this right now, but I was reminded of this poem this morning because I reread. I've been reading intensively these days. What's his name? I'm having a senior moment here. Leopardi.
Right.
And thinking about translating Leopardi. And I reread your essay, the Nietzsche of Recanati. Recanati is where he lived in Italy, which is a beautiful, beautiful essay. And some of what comes into L, I mean, I hadn't read your essay before, obviously, when I wrote L, but you talk in similar terms about Leopardi. That is a magnificent, magnificent essay. That's one of your essays that I by the way, David, I think you're an absolute master of the short essay, and they rise to poetry, some of them, and I hope we'll be able to talk about some of what you're doing in the essays in a little while. But that's a simply magnificent essay, and you do such justice to Leopardi, even though you know, as a Christian theologian, you obviously find him wanting in some way.
Well, I don't know if I find him wanting. I find him. I mean, like Nietzsche, he's one of those atheists that you're proud to think of as not as an opponent, but as a critic of the tradition, because his genius rises to the level of the themes that he's struggling with. You know, the only sort of atheist with whom I have any problems at all, because I'm not a particularly dogmatical sort of soul, and I can easily see things from the other perspective quite well. You know, I'm not what you would call firm in the faith or any of that. But the sort of atheists who annoy me are the sort of the Richard Dawkins kind, who just start with a fatuous set of fatuous presuppositions regarding what religious passion is or what believers believe, and then it proceeds to show just how fatuous it is. But you know, someone like Leopardi, or for that matter Nietzsche at his best, a more morally problematic character than Leopardi, there's nothing there to which I object, and nothing that I would wish that he had done otherwise. I think all I say in criticism is every once in a while he's a bit shallower than in, and this is because we were talking about the Zibaldone. It's such a huge collection that there are moments of pure brilliance, but they're interlarded with a few moments where you realize that you're dealing with a person who understandably, who suffered a great deal. Physically suffered, understandably becomes more petulant than profound. But on the whole, Leopardi is just a towering genius. And you were thinking of translating his verse, you say?
I'm thinking of doing a few. Because I find the available translations very thin. Yeah,
no, they are. Again, many of them done well. I'm trying to remember. What's his name? He's a friend of T.S. Eliot's and W.H. Auden, who did. I'm having my senior moment now. Forgive me, but anyway, yeah, no, he's never been done sufficient justice. He's like Hölderlin, because he writes odes, as it were, these large, resonant, sonorous periods. Poets can fall too easily into just sort of producing what's on the page is little more than prose broken up arbitrarily into separate lines, and you don't get the music. And Leopardi is a very musical poet.
He is. Yeah.
We can get into it, the issue of faith or faithlessness, or if you like.
Sure.
Because that poem L, which I wanted to talk about anyway. Now that I think about it, I'd probably forgotten to. It's a powerful. It's a powerful piece of verse. It's not. It's not. It's not facile skepticism or disdain. It has that sort of quality of the you know what I mean? Auseinandersetzung. I'm forgetting my German too. The sort of the struggling with the angel, in a sense, in that it's a bitterness without the sort of shallow petulance of a Dawkins, who just to my mind, his is the atheism of the well-fed. His is just the atheism of somebody who has a picture of reality that he likes. He has a very sort of thin notion. There's no long cultural memory, no personal memory there, no memory of any kind, what the passion of faith might have been. Mm-hmm. And so the engagement at the end of the day just becomes a series of cheap quips aimed at fundamentalists.
Right. Yeah.
That's not what's going on in your poem there.
No, I hope not.
No.
Could we complicate this a little bit? Because I wanted to ask you about one of your essays, Reason's Faith.
Okay.
Which I think is a magnificent piece also. It's the one right after the Leopardi essay in The Dream Child's Progress.
I remember that.
You remember that. And could I quote you, or do you want to read it yourself?
I don't have a copy here, so...
It's on page 258 to 260. This is a passage I think is very important in terms of, also because I connect this to what you're saying in That All Shall Be Saved, which is the work of yours that I've actually used in my Dante writing.
We also want to talk about, so let's put a check mark next to that.
Right, okay, yeah, there are lots of things to talk about, but this is, to me, a really fascinating paragraph. What, after all, warrants our belief in the power of rational consciousness to give us a true knowledge of reality? Whether we wish to acknowledge it or not, there is a fiduciary moment within every act of reason which allows for thought's first movement towards ends beyond itself. It is an implicit trust in an original accord between mind and world, mysterious but indissoluble, and it is one that protest how we may, makes sense only if we presume some original ontological unity between consciousness and being. Every attempt of the rational mind to find the truth of things involves an implicit metaphysical presupposition that there is some transcendent coincidence of world and soul, some original fullness of reality where they are always already one, which allows for their openness one to the other here below. One traditional way of saying this is that mind and world, according to their different modes, both participate in the same eternal forms, but that merely defers the epistemological enigma to a higher level of reality. Even this accord between intelligence and intelligible forms seems necessarily to point towards some still higher, more eminent unity in the simplicity of a first principle in God. Only this permits us to believe that being is already manifestation, that it is by nature intelligible and comes to fruition as it discloses itself in soul. There is a reciprocal transparency of mind and world, an essential belonging of each to the other, because in their transcendent source, they are one. That's a fascinating paragraph, and I think it undergirds your work in important ways. I mean, I think it's there in That All Shall Be Saved, at the back of it, although you never actually say this in That All Shall Be Saved. But it's what permits you to, I mean, there are two things that permit you to make the argument in That All Shall Be Saved. One is your reading, of course, of the scriptures, right? And of the theological tradition. And the other is this accord, mysterious accord of mind and being that you develop in this paragraph I just read.
I'm glad you read it, because I always sound better to myself when in someone else's voice. I have to say, if I were to read it myself, I I'm going on again. Well, I mean, what you're saying is true. I mean, on the one hand, it's, you know, sort of straightforward kind of Neoplatonic, Vedantic, metaphysical structure, but to the argument. But I am saying something there that allows me to have a certain confidence that one can reason one's way towards truths. Mm-hmm. I think actually, though, that I would take that same paragraph and read it as what I understand is going on in the arts. It's not just an argument about, philosophy or the sciences or epistemology, because, of course, in the Anglophone world, we've adopted, by and large, as our philosophical model, the analytic tradition. And at the end of the analytic tradition, or at the base of it, you know, you can make all sorts of arguments about what it's doing or what it does. But that very word analytic tells you that it understands the pursuit of truth as, in a sense, a pursuit of a tautology. That is, that you remain confined within language, and what you're trying to do is to take any complex proposition and break it down into individual, discrete, simple propositions that are analytically true, that, you know, basically A equals A. And trusting that one way or another, that the world, to the degree we can know it, can be approached by way of propositional thinking, and to the degree that it can't be reduced to propositions is unknowable to us. That's not the continental tradition, obviously, where there is this notion of an ontological coincidence between knowing and being. But it's also, I honestly believe that in the arts, real dimensions of experience, real dimensions of reality, true dimension, are disclosing themselves, that there's a communion there too, a nuptial between, say, the poet and the world he or she is speaking.
Yeah.
You see, there's a kind of faith there in, when I think that way, a faith in the possibility of the being of the world manifesting itself in our response to it, in a way that's not just reducible to propositions, but that isn't just an empty kind of emotional reaction to an impenetrable otherness.
Right.
I honestly, it sounds kind of superstitious, I do, have a certain belief in that, that almost Vatic notion of the poet. Vates, of course, in Latin, being both prophet and poet,
right,
or of any other artist. And and it could be just a pathetic longing to believe this.
What?
A pathetic longing. I mean, it could be, we can tell ourselves that the arts are simply how we distract ourselves from mortality or tedium, but I don't think that's why we do it. I don't think that there'd be this insatiable hunger in us always to create, and always to appreciate and love what's created. I mean, there are moments when you stand before a certain canvas, and I always, for some reason, I don't know why, I always tend to use the example of Chardin. I don't know why. I think it's because I just love the depths of color in his canvases. I say that at times he actually, to get the kind of depth, before he would glaze and glaze and glaze, he would actually take his thumbs to mix the pigment on the canvas, trying to get the richness of a certain hue in a plum or something. In one sense, what you're just getting is a representation of a still life, and yet suddenly you're seeing it as if it's the revelation of a mystery as deep as being itself. It's an extraordinary thing. And to my mind, in that experience, something much more is going on than simply, I'm being titillated by something pretty. So that about reason, the essay Reason's Faith. It's not actually just about epistemology. It's about the total possibility of the experience of being in every dimension of our spiritual, I say, geistliche, life. I mean, intellectual, artistic, emotional, the way we relate to others.
Right.
Because as I've been working on the project, you know that I don't just write essays, right? Actually, you gave me a very nice. Speaking of endorsements, your endorsement for Roland and Moonlight was deeply appreciated. By the way,
no, you're a novelist. You write stories. You're a fine poet. Although you attribute all your poems to your uncle Aloysius.
Well, that's so that I can blame him for the bad ones. But in that book, the better ones are kept for the end, and that's why I said, well, Aloysius got better, but all the bad. But then if there's a bad line in the later ones that someone points out to me, I can just say, well, that's not my fault. That was Aloysius. He's the imp on my shoulder. But what I mean is that it's in the other areas of writing quite often that I feel this most strongly. I do like writing essays. I mean, I think there is an art to the essay that isn't practiced enough. I mean, that there are some good essayists out there I very much admire, but at present it's not as valued a form as it once was, I think. But the truth is my experiences at times, there have been moments when I felt that what I was doing was more than myself. You can say, you can use the word inspiration, you can talk about divine inspiration, you can talk about being speaking through, but in the sense that that there is more to what's going on, that there's more of a point to the creation of poetry or translation or novels or essays than simply ways of distracting us. And I don't want to go on at too much length here, but let me point out, as I do work in philosophy of mind, it is kind of surprising the degree to which the lengths to which the committed physicalist reductionist will go in trying to do away with any hint that there's a greater mystery of consciousness than there is, say, the mystery of how the pistons in a steam engine work.
Right.
They will, say, well, consciousness is an illusion, which is an absurd statement, but I mean, the notion of the consciousness as we understand it, what's actually going on, what we take to be consciousness or intentionality or the unity of experience, things that seem to be self-evidently and undeniably real to any person who's willing just to accept that there could be a mystery that can't be reduced to purely mechanistic terms. They'll say, well, no, actually, what's going on there in the mind is simply a kind of allegory or even a user interface between us and a reality that's even more deeply inaccessible to us than Kant's Ding an sich. It's just a realm of pure Galilean, velocity without qualities, velocity, mass, force. And that this entire rich world of experience we have is nothing but a kind of either epiphenomenal or utilitarian mediation for a reality that's nothing, utterly alien to us and is purely mindless mechanism.
Yeah.
Now, I don't believe.
Why do you think there's that tendency now in contemporary science? Is it just an inclination not to want to countenance dualism of any kind because it smacks of God?
Well, yeah, there's that in part, and there is, of course, a kind of unreconstructed mechanistic metaphysics that was the rise of the mechanical philosophy in the 17th century was purely a matter of method at first. I mean, it was obviously an attempt to create an inductive, and it didn't succeed because pure induction is impossible. But it was, it was sequestered from the realm of God and spirit and soul, but it was crudely sequestered. It became a sort of Cartesian dualism and substance dualism. And at that point, you can see why the scientific mind would rebel at that, because that's just creating, for the passionate scientific mind, it shouldn't be possible simply to take that much of reality and say it lies outside the realm of what we're doing. Because the scientific curiosity is omnivorous. It wants an ultimate explanation. It doesn't just want proximate explanation. So on one hand, there's a noble desire that doesn't want to be confined in a dualistic a picture of reality. But on the other hand, there is a kind of unthinking mechanistic materialism that should have been transcended ages ago, because both physics and the life sciences have moved us beyond. I think all the really interesting work in molecular biology, for instance, now shows that your hierarchical systems of life are not reducible to purely emergentist mechanist models and all that. But that's a different issue. But with consciousness, it becomes absurd because, of course, you've methodologically predestined yourself. I mean, the whole point of the mechanistic philosophy is to remove from nature any trace of what look like mental categories.
Right.
Final causes, formal causes, intentions, subjectivity even, because it aspires to be a purely third-person discourse. Now, this is interesting because there is really no such thing as a third-person perspective. A third-person perspective can only ever be a distillate of so many first-person perspectives. So they've removed every trace of mind from their understanding of the structure of nature. the sort of the Aristotelian picture that being and thought have analogous structures. And once you've done that, trying to reintegrate the phenomena of mind into the picture of nature is impossible because you've already excluded it. And so you end up saying things. Daniel Dennett's a very intelligent man, but his books on the philosophy of mind are insanely stupid because he's willing because for him, if you allow that there really is such a thing as genuine subjective consciousness, qualitative consciousness, the way we think of them, real intentionality, as if you really, when you use words, when you're writing a poem, you really are using those words according to their meaning, their semantic meanings within a complex syntax, rather than actually, which he would say is the case, it's a kind of functionalist illusion that there isn't, really, really real intentionality. You just end up with an absurd picture of reality. And yet so much of English language and philosophy of mind works in that way. And, I think I've said this before. I think I said this to you when we were having lunch several months ago in South Bend, is that what I found is in the sciences and in philosophy and in general, when the phenomena don't fit the theory, you eliminate the theory. Only in philosophy of mind has it become traditional to eliminate the phenomena and hold on to the theory. Well, all of that goes back to this. I mean, to me, to be honest, the reason I see things very differently, it's not just that I think that this is bad logic and so on and so forth, and it's not just because I believe in God, because I don't, I certainly don't believe in the God they think people believe in, the large psychological subject in the sky who goes through periods of depression and angst and whimsy or whatever else. But it's also because, as I say, these experiences, to me, I really believe that there is an openness of mind and will and desire to the world, and an openness of the world to consciousness that's a real and primordial truth that underlies the arts, the sciences, our humanity in general.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you. What are you going to call this book?
The one on mind?
Yeah.
Well, you see, this is a problem. I keep changing the title every day. So at the moment, I don't have one.
Okay.
But I mean, it's more than. I will explain. It goes into these issues we're talking about now, because it doesn't stop short at dealing with the technical issues of mind of the sort you get in Anglophone philosophy. It starts there, dealing with those phenomena of mind that don't seem to fit into the physicalist reductionist picture. I do my best to give the other side as much credit as possible in trying to come up with a more plausible reductionism. But that's only the beginning of the book. From there, I do actually move on to these issues of what a phenomenology of consciousness reveals about the relationship of mind and world, and whether or not it necessarily presumes a kind of transcendent coincidence of the sort that paragraph that you so beautifully read for me names.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. As a poet, you must have, can I put it? I mean, I've never known a writer or an artist or poet who can't attest to those moments when
I can attest to them very, very well. In fact, some of the most, to me, the most wonderful gifts that I've received in poetry are precisely those moments. And I think this whole book, An Alphabet, is really a gift, because the letters, the sound of the letter, I say in the very last poem, Z2, my alphabet allowed me to beget each of these poems through its letter's sound.
Yeah.
It gave them birth. So the sound of the letter somehow gave birth to the poem. So as in L, obviously. So there are a lot of homonymic moments, but I've had many experiences in poetry where somehow the poem allowed me to say something that I didn't even know I wanted to say.
Yeah.
The poem, and that's the most exciting thing when that, for me, when that happens in poetry.
Again, I think everyone has this experience. Now, it could be, I mean, one can, and I don't presume how one should think about it. I mean, some people say, well, you know, the unconscious, you can be very Freudian about it and say the unconscious, you know, takes over and has riches that the conscious mind can gain access to only fitfully, or I don't know, like Julian Jaynes, you can think of the two hemispheres having, you know, I'm not going to say that you can just from that experience deduce an entire metaphysics, but I have to say, for me, when the experience has been real, there have been times when I just feel that something in excess of myself has given me the gift of being allowed to participate in how it expresses something out there in excess of myself.
I think that's very true, for example, in Dante. I mean, I wrote a little essay about Dante's use of terza rima, because I think the terza rima, it's such an intricate form. The form itself almost creates content at certain points. So it allows Dante to come up to invent, to come upon a way of saying something that he hadn't necessarily expected he would say. So, I mean, the Freudian model where it's back in the unconscious, I think is not accurate, because there's much more of an interaction.
Yeah.
Whether it's with language itself or with world or something else.
Right. No. Well, I rarely anymore. It's inevitable at times that I have to talk about Heidegger as just such an unpleasant person. I like to, but it's that you know, the poet is also the one through whom language is speaking. I mean, there are powers and depths in language, and language as, especially for rational beings, language uses, and I don't put any necessary limits on whom that includes, but the world becomes manifest in coming to utterance. There's this, you know, the essay on humanism ends with this extended double metaphor. It's something like, you know, let our words be the words of being, as clouds are the clouds of the sky, you know, and then it shifts to the thinker, although you could change that to poet, makes inconspicuous furrows in the surface of the earth, like the plowman, soft, you know, slow of tread, makes in the field, or whatever, in language, sorry, like the plowman, slow of tread, makes furrows in the field. I often think that, of course, that image, he's playing on his own surname, of course, Heidegger, heath harrower, pagan heathen farmer, you know, you can translate. But I mean, the point is that on the one hand, you have being, the sky, and then language gives it dimension, depth, manifestation, the way the clouds in the sky. And then what the thinker, the poet, is doing is working in the immensity of language, trying to make small, inconspicuous, but nonetheless significant, you know, deliverances from language. So for him, there's this sort of hierarchy of being and language, and then the creative poet. Now, I wish a nicer, a more admirable person had said this, but I think there's a truth in that, you know, speaking of terza rima, I know that you and I share a certain admiration for Lawrence Binyon's translation of the Divine Comedy.
Yeah.
for just that reason, is that he was the only man apparently insane enough actually to write a terza rima translation in English, which should have been impossible, but
Yeah, he did it. I mean, some of it's clunky,
yeah.
but he has a fine mind. There's a very lovely appreciation of his translation by Robert Fitzgerald, the translator of Homer, in an anthology called The Poet's Dante. That's just a very, very wonderful appreciation. And I came to admire that. I mean, I've always sort of used my mentor, Alan Mandelbaum's blank verse translation, which I'm very fond of. And I think Mandelbaum has a beautiful slowness of vowels sometimes.
Yeah.
And he gets the tempo right. But I think I admire Binion a lot, much more than what's her name, Dorothy Sayers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Dorothy Sayers translation. I mean, she was a fine scholar, and I love the Lord Peter Wimsey mysteries.
Yes. So, I do too.
The translations, the translation of Dante is a little, it's a little plain where it shouldn't be, and a bit, well, I just find the ingenuity of Binion impressive. Too, even in the places where it doesn't wholly succeed, you do have to say, well, that was damned clever,
Right.
But I mean, just to finish on this thing, then, I mean, this issue, there actually, I can think of like 2 or 3 experiences in my life in which the sense not so much as coming up with something and writing it, because I like to think of myself as clever, so I like coming up with a clever idea and translating it into prose or verse or whatever. But there have been times when my cleverness had absolutely nothing to do with it. I thought where the thing I was writing really was, in some sense. I mean, maybe this is why people who create things become instinctive Platonists, the same way mathematicians do. Mathematicians always, they're discovering an eternal order. They're not, even when they're inventing whole new areas in the in mathematics. And I think they're both things you've read that I felt were there before I wrote them. In fact, I dreamt parts of them both. One was that short piece called The True Helen, the short story.
Yeah. That's an amazing piece.
Well, thank you. It's actually my favorite of all the things I've written, mostly because I don't understand it fully. I understand it.
I don't think I understand it either.
But I'm certain that it's entirely coherent. That's the thing. That's why I feel that it was there before I wrote it, because I on the one hand, I mean, yes, there's the kind of Gnostic imagery. There's the sort of Hans Jonas sense of, I feel I'm a stranger in this world, and this life isn't my real life. My true self is elsewhere. That much I can understand, but there are other aspects of it that I felt.
Can you give me an example? Do you let's see. I think in A Splendid Wickedness,
right,
and on page 227 of.
Yeah, again, I don't have a copy of it with me here, but I mean, for one thing, I mean, I'm not sure if I understand. I mean, this is a very simple thing, whether Helen of Tyre in the second half of it really is remembering the memories of Helen of Troy, right? I don't know if that's important or not. And when I've been asked by people who've read it, whether she is, I've always said, I just don't know. For some reason, I feel that there are aspects of that come from somewhere slightly above my pay grade, and that I was, I mean, I know the degree to which I worked on it. I mean, I recognize my prose and all that. It's not that I'm not pretending that I'm a medium that received it, but nonetheless, I just remember I dreamt it in part, and it just shows that I do too much reading in late antiquity, that I have dreams about, like a figure in the story of Simon Magus or whatever. And the story occurred to me all at once, in its totality, in its disjunction, and it had a perfect fittingness for me. I understood part of it, but part of it I still feel to this day that fittingness of what I did there might require a better reader than myself to understand. Another story, well, I think we've also talked about it, the House of Apollo. I can give you a concrete example there.
Okay.
At the end, you have read that story, right? Because I think yeah. And because you said something nice about it to me in an email, and I never forget something nice said about my fiction. I cherish it, like a miser, the coins. At the end, the old priest has a vision of Apollo departing the temple from behind. Mm-hmm. And there is no question in my mind that picks up on the image of Moses in the cleft in the rock, seeing the Yofi, the glory of God, pass by, and seeing only the hinder parts, seeing only God from behind, seeing only the back of God as God passes by. But I swear it wasn't consciously in my mind when I wrote it, and yet when it was pointed out to me, I knew that it could not possibly have been intended, if not by me, then something in me. So it's moments like that.
Well, that's a really lovely aspect to your sensibility, the way in which these different traditions merge and come together and then move apart. So
not everyone finds it lovely, but
really,
there are the fideists of every tradition who worry about whoring after strange gods, and that sort of thing. But I don't have much to do with them. They're not a big part of my life. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've spent a long time on this, but yeah, I mean, I think I'll always have that sense that reason's faith is that there is, and I think phenomenologically this is true too. I mean, we why is it we want to know the truth? What is it that prompts us to? It's never, say, the scientist or the philosopher, take it out of the realms of the arts, the scientist. There would be an essential triviality if it were mere curiosity, if it weren't, and the one that, but more than that, it also, what would prompt us to care, What is that deeper longing for a kind of transcendental value, truth as such? I need to know truth, not just a truth. I need to see beauty, not just a beautiful thing. It's always, that at the very ground of our volition, our intentionality towards the world, before we're even conscious of it, there's already a desire for something we seem to know without yet having seen.
Yeah. And it gives you a kind of passionate. So, for example, in that all shall be saved, it makes for the passion of that book, right? That you're in touch with the truth, and that the quote unquote infernalists are they're not what they're saying is not true. Now, of course, that could be deconstructed,
sure,
right? It easily deconstructed, but that's not the point. The point is that passionate commitment is very, very important, and it gives you that. So I think that's marvelous. I don't know, another essay that I recently reread and I thought was just absolutely fantastic is The Angels of
Sacré-Cœur.
Sacré-Cœur. The Angels of Sacré-Cœur. That's a beautiful, beautiful essay, and so complicated in terms of the old world and the new, and France as having been tied to Christendom, and something which is no longer possible there, and then America and the strange American religiosity,
which isn't housed in enduring forms. Yeah,
right. I mean, you give it its due, which I'm maybe a little bit more reluctant to do because all these nutcases on the right who are,
well, tell me about that.
And we're on the same page about that, but still, you do. I mean, give it its due. I mean, it has a kind of what should I say? It has a kind of power. It has a kind of power, but that's a fantastic essay.
I think also that's kind of that again, the prophetic ferment without form is itself an expression of the very thing we've been talking about, that it is an irrepressible desire, and sometimes it takes durable cultural forms that can control it or allow it to flower into something. But sometimes it doesn't. The thing about that essay is, of course, I wrote it before the MAGA moment, before I was aware of it. And it's funny, I think about it very differently now from both ends of the spectrum, because on the one hand, you have the nostalgia for Christendom on the sort of traditionalist right, especially the Catholic traditionalist right, the sort of the people who regard Viktor Orban as a saintly figure. It expresses itself in this sort of fascination with Baroque throne and altar culture and Christendom. Incredibly pernicious, and on the other hand, the sort of American, the sort of mad apocalyptic politics, both of which have oddly converged in the various new forms of right-wing politics in our time. So I think if I were to write that essay now, there'd be a much deeper sense of perturbation regarding both.
Yeah. Can I press you on something in this essay?
Sure, but I can't promise to be still on board with everything I said then. So.
Okay, fair enough. But this is, I mean, for me, the difficult and troubling point where you say on the bottom page 163. Well, you say in the beginning of the paragraph, still the worst fate that could befall America, one far grimmer than the mere loss of some of its fiscal or political supremacy in the world, would be the final triumph of a true cultural secularism. And then you say the secularist impulse can create nothing of enduring value. It corrupts the will and the imagination with the deadening boredom of an ultimate pointlessness, weakens the hunger for the good, true, and beautiful.
Well,
what if one is not a believer? In no sense am I a believer. I'm a poet, so I'm coming at even transcendent moments through art.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do with B?
I think I would change the wording, because, of course, I was using secularism in the way just at that moment it was fashionable to be for Steven Pinker and others,
right,
in which they were arguing by secularism. What they meant was not just an open society that was committed to a plurality of views. They were speaking of secularism as one which, as a reality in which even the questions of religion would not be taken as serious questions. Right. Like Steven Pinker didn't want philosophers in the university who believed in transcendent realities. He would just say this, and it was an incredibly, at that moment, the way the word was being used, it was being used as a kind of regime of how you're allowed to think of reality to be a serious thinker. I don't mean, I'm not talking, when I talk about saying, I'm not talking about atheists. I'm not talking about agnostics. I was talking principally about a certain understanding of modernity,
right.
in which, and the funny thing is, of course,
I'm on your side on that. Yeah.
But I would phrase it differently now, just to be clear, because I've discovered that ever since, I was sick, very sick in 2014 for a while, and when I came out of it, it was like entering into a different reality. Donald Trump was running for president, and someone told me this, and I laughed. I thought, that's ridiculous. Yeah. Little did I know. Not only did he get elected, but then the very place where I had been living just a couple of years before, where I had fallen sick, Charlottesville, was invaded by unmasked, proud Nazis.
Right.
A whole world that I didn't realize was incubating in the shadows of the internet. And so now I'm much more careful about the things I make jokes about. But by secularism, I wasn't talking about belief or unbelief. Don't get me wrong. I was talking about the notion that you have to create a society according to a certain dogmatic model. I'm every bit as nasty about people who want to create, like, say, a Catholic culture, to replace Roman Catholic, the new integralists. I'm much nastier about them. But I would rephrase that now. I would make clear that people understood that I was not advocating integralism, that I wasn't advocating a regime of faith or suggesting that unbelievers have not, that you need to be a believer to create something. I meant a specific ideology which I associated with. I'll give you an example. For instance, it was right after I read this. I think it was at the same time I was reading an argument between Steven Pinker and Wieseltier. Mm-hmm. Assuming he pronounces his name correctly. I don't know how Americanized it is. I've never heard him. And Pinker was suggesting that the humanities had a lot to learn from computer science because you could do these stochastic models of, you could do these computer analyses of poems that would explain the neurological effects they had on listeners. And that and Wieseltier tried to explain to him, I thought with more patience than I could have mastered, what the point of poetry is. And, that the notion that you can just apply quantitative methods to it. I have to admit, that's the sort of thing I associated the term he was using with. Yeah. The sort of everything, that there is a specific kind of rationality. Right. That society has to be built around, and it has to be the sort of post-religious consensus in which people's religious and cultural identities are just so much decorative, domestic, personal, elective, and have nothing to do with how we interact with one another in public. I take a much more cosmopolitan view of the reality I'd like to see. To me, I kind of, if I have my ideal dream of a perfect society, it's one in which it's like one of those moments in history where everything is open and everything is flowing together without conflict, all the cultures, all the religions, all the philosophies, sort of the late Greco-Roman ideal without the violence of the Roman Empire holding it all together. Mm-hmm. But I don't think of that as secular. I just think of that as cosmopolitan. I use the Stoic term.
But to take for me to, in a way, to take your position, which is not really your position, but this is complicated. I mean, if somebody such as myself, am I becoming more and more attenuated? My relationship to art and my relationship to poetry, is it more and more of an attenuation of something that without the explicit religious impulse, is our culture going to become simply more and more attenuated? I mean, in a way, that was Nietzsche's concern.
Well, I mean, that's it. I mean, that was Nietzsche's fear, right? That the last men, because and he blamed Christianity in a sense for having first disenchanted the world, and then through a kind of resentfulness or spitefulness within itself, in its demand of absolute truth, having eliminated even itself, even its own God. So it just evacuated, sponged away the horizon, and it brought about the death of God. And that this leads to a danger, right? The last men. And that's the whole point of the Übermensch, right? Is instead we should be striving for a Leonardo or something that which is beyond the human, because the vertical aspiration is not possible now. So aspiration towards a future that is more than, that's not just außermenschliche. And I think, I think that's a real question we ask ourselves, not whether one has to adhere to specific religious beliefs or not, but whether or not you have a dogmatic refusal to acknowledge the lure of the transcendent, and it becomes a cultural grammar. Yeah, I think that the danger of a sort of just total consumerism, total immersion, and I think the arts pass away. I mean, I think really honestly, one of the reasons the arts as such are not essential. On one hand, of course, we just have more distractions. I mean, technology is fascinating. It does things that our animal brains react to. It's got bright lights and loud sounds, and it makes things, allows us to talk, you and me, to have a face-to-face conversation across a distance like this. But on the other hand, I mean, I see the sort of atrophy of the desire for the interest in the arts, and you taught in the university. I mean, you've seen how the humanities are trying not to contract against this constant pressure, this sort of utilitarian pressure. Just be in the STEM disciplines, be in the business school. If you have to justify the humanities, say that they give you mental skills that help you be successful in business. And so, whereas of course the point of the humanities is not to teach us to be successful businessmen and women, it's to teach us to be humane, teach us to be human, teach us the fullness and the glory and grandeur. So I do worry about that. Yeah, I do think that not the end of any given faith or any given kind of religious belief or even an explicit kind of theism, but just the alternative regime, the sort of and that's what I meant by secularism, the sort of the modern, the mechanized nature in which totally disenchanted in the reign of technology, the notion, again, sound like Heidegger here, in which all of nature, being itself, becomes just a standing reserve of resources to be exploited by the adventures of the human will. To create objects of consumption. When I waste more money than I have, it's going to be on something like your translation of Ronsard. That's what I buy. So I buy too many books and too much music, and not good for a Christian socialist. But there you have it. But that's not. I mean, for the most part, even that's not the consumerism we have. We're not consuming objects of enduring culture. What we mostly consume are objects of transient distraction or utility, quickly to be replaced by something else, because that's the underlying logic of our economy, and as such becomes the underlying logic of our culture. I mean, just ask you, as you say, you yourself are not a religious person, but do you ever wonder, I mean, worry about, wonder about the capacity for wonder that that our culture encourages?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think what I mean is,
I'm thinking of what the Aristotle philosophy begins in wonder, right?
Yeah, Plato, right, and
Plato,
and being able to say there's a mystery here, not just.
Yeah, no, I agree, and you have to be open to all of that. I completely agree, and there's some way in which we're producing mechanized human beings who are not open to that. I completely agree with you.
I mean, I think in the arts, it's always interested me is that the arts tend to gravitate towards religious themes, I think, not just as a matter of cultural economy. It's not just because they're patrons, but, again, in part, I think it's because we are engaged with something mysterious when we create things, that there is the sense that there's a horizon beyond the visible horizon that's prompting us towards itself. But even when, the explicit belief isn't there, the absence of that belief becomes a theme in some sense. A reason I wanted to talk about your poem, L, is what's interesting about it is, in a sense, it's a very religious poem.
Yeah, true.
It's a religious passion expressed on the obverse side, perhaps, but it's what gives it its force too. I mean, there's, and I don't think that you can write a poem like that if you're not fundamentally open to the mystery, one way or the other, engaged in both the mystery of the world and in what it doesn't, deliver, so to speak.
Sure.
That I just think Steven Pinker, given his understanding of poetry, would get what's going on in that poem. He would just see it as, well, why didn't you just write, why do you feel you have to express it that way at all?
Right.
And so yeah, no, I mean, I do. I mean, this is constant because I'm not of the dogmatic sort, and being since I don't believe anyone's going to hell for not believing in God. I don't think there's an epistemological test, did you get the right answers? That's not what I'm worried about. But I do worry about. I think, and part of the irony of this is the same people who are most sort of militantly capitalist, militantly consumerist, and militantly sort of supply side economics, most opposed to, say, trying to save the world from imminent destruction by overuse and abuse, also claim to be the most passionately committed to one or another kind of dogmatic religion, usually white evangelical Christianity or traditionalist Catholicism or what have you. But, and I keep repeating myself here, so I'll say it for the last time, yes, I too worry about the last men in one sense. I think that that openness to the mystery of being expressed in the arts, it is what makes us human, and more than human in a merely biological sense. It is what engages us uniquely in the world that shows itself, and gives us a kind of privileged but also very dangerous role in the way being manifests itself.
Yeah.
So can we talk about Dante? I don't want to forget to talk about Dante before we, because we are slowly approaching. I think we've actually gone back. I told you this would happen. 90 minutes. It's sort of, but you're working on a project on Dante now.
Yeah, I am.
And it seems that this might be the perfect moment to talk about it. What is the project?
Well, this is so strange. I mean, I said I'm in no sense a believer. I'm a secular Jew, but I've been so passionate about the Commedia for such a long time, and I'm convinced that what Dante is struggling with in the Commedia is and of course most of the methodologically Dantes don't agree. They think there's a kind of univocal impulse in the poem, and I think he's a very divided soul because he wants to be faithful to the church of his time, but at the same time he's very much subversive. So in Paradiso 19, for example, you have this figure of he worries about the man born along the shoreline of the Indus River who's never heard of Christ. but he's a good man. Where is the justice in him not being among the saved? But if you're for Christians of that time,
right,
if you were not baptized into the Holy Roman Church, you couldn't be among the saved. So, and of course, the most important figure for Dante on this is Virgil. So the piece I have in this it's a long essay. It's called "The Tragedy of Dante's Comedy," and the second half focuses on Virgil, and the first half focuses on Paradiso 19 and that whole issue of the man born along the shoreline of the Indus River. And then Dante is wrestling with he's divided between, and here we can go back to what we were talking about with your book, that all shall be saved. I used that book not in that essay, but in another essay that would be the first part of this project. He has a kind of Job topos, that is that God is utterly transcendent. So how can we know what God actually thinks, what he wants, and so on? But then he has the Neoplatonist idea that our mind has to be a ray of the divine mind. So he knows on some level that his qualms about the man born along the shoreline of the Indus River must express some kind of reality, because from this Neoplatonist conception, which you were expressing in a more from a more modern point of view as a coincidence of soul and world in reason's faith, and then of course in your book, That All Shall Be Saved, you blow out of the water this this infernalist conception, and in another essay I look at Inferno 3, where Dante is coming upon the sign on the gate of hell, and where the line is in the Mandelbaum translation anyway, the highest reason and the primal love. So what created hell? The primal love. And Dante the Pilgrim says to Virgil at that point, "Master, these words are difficult for me, duro." And there's an really inspired pun there, because duro is an adjective, but in the I don't have the text in front of me, but and I endure. He makes hell speak in the first person, right? And I endure eternally, duro. So the verb and the adjective are the same thing,
right.
duro. And it's really difficult for Dante to accept that hell could have been the product of the divine love. Now, from a certain point of view, of course, God isn't hate unless you're a Calvinist, and you point this out in That All Shall Be Saved. But where God hates the sinners, right, and only loves those who are among the elect.
That is actually, yes, in Calvin's reading of the Johannine epistles, yeah.
Right, but for a Catholic, God would have to be loved, because God isn't hate. God is perfect love, right? So logically, if hell exists, if an eternal hell exists, it would have to have been created by the primal love. Well, that's at best a paradox, at worst an utter contradiction, and Dante the Pilgrim doesn't know what to do with it. And the way in which most Dante readers, in coming from Charles Singleton, this is like the first part of the project, have dealt with this, is to say that basically to say that Dante the poet, as opposed to the Pilgrim, the poet's judgments are rigid. So they're the judgments of the church, and he simply is aligned with the church. I don't think that's the case at all. I think he's much more a self-divided figure. He's much more torn. And so that's in a nutshell the project that I'm working on with Dante. The last part of it is on the canto on faith in Paradiso 24, and there's some I hope interesting aspects to that piece of it.
Well, I'm looking forward to. I read part of the chapter you sent me, and there are actually sort of universalist readings of Dante. There are a few out there, like Mark Vernon, who say this is, that Dante's torn soul in this ultimately bends in the Paradiso in a certain direction. I don't think you can demonstrate that, but it is true. I think that far too often Dante's just been read as a very well-written catechism.
Yeah, exactly.
And I agree with you that there are all sorts of ambiguities in there that go unacknowledged, and the notion that at the end of the day he simply unambiguously opts for obedience to the doctrine he's being told is interestingly at odd places not borne out by the text, simply because when he holds his silence.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm very much interested in this, just because, for one thing, I do get tired of Dante being conscripted into the project of a kind of triumphalist cultural Catholicism, in which he's just another text that affirms without any reservations, kind of pure and undiluted version, usually of Thomism, you're told.
Yeah.
And so if nothing else, I'm looking forward to a book written from another perspective. Let me just put someone who doesn't feel you have to reaffirm the party line. Do you think you're going to venture the Leopardi? I mean, he does deserve a somewhat better advocate in English verse that he generally has had in the past.
I'm at the very beginning of that,
Okay.
and I doubt that I would do a whole Leopardi, but I might do a couple of poems.
Yeah.
So I'm looking closely at one called "To Sylvia," which is a heartbreaking poem. You probably remember it. It's about a young girl who dies very young of tuberculosis, and on the cusp of womanhood. And I mean, Leopardi was such a terrible pessimist that,
Oh, well.
Yeah, I mean, you express this very beautifully in your the Nietzsche of Recanati, where nature never makes good on its promises.
Yeah.
So it's a terribly tragic poem, but it's a very, very beautiful poem. So that's the one I'm thinking about doing now, and we'll see. But I actually don't know if I can do it. So I have no confidence yet that this is something I can do. We'll see.
Well,
it's a little bit like, and you mentioned Leopardi in connection with Hölderlin. Hölderlin is also an extremely difficult poet to translate.
Yeah.
For one thing, and it's a little bit true of Leopardi for similar reasons. For one thing, with Hölderlin, how did he manage to avoid rhyme? What does it come out of? I mean, it's almost miraculous that he doesn't need rhyme.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, I mean, there is you're talking about a poet, actually, of whom you can say that, I think Heine is another example in German of being able to do with language pretty much whatever he wanted to do.
Yeah.
In the case of Hölderlin, though, these, I mean, obviously his veneration of the classical.
Yes, he got it from the class. That's the answer,
Yeah,
obviously. But
right.
still, it's both an answer to question, because he's a German poet. So, and the same with Leopardi, right? I mean, both of them have this deep relationship to the classics. But still, how are they evading the conventions and the traditions of their own languages, and making that kind of leap backwards and forwards, right? Where they don't need. Now, Leopardi did use rhyme, but in a very asymmetrical kind of way.
Yeah.
So this is something I will. This is a formal problem in terms of
Well,
translating Leopardi.
what I always thought would be difficult, and also just, I mean, with Hölderlin, the danger always seems to me that you begin becoming formless in your translation in a way that the original German is not formless. You know that
Exactly.
it's very controlled cadences. Yeah, the lines are long. You know, if you're doing a syllabic count, I think 16, 14, 14, 16. Right. But and, you know, and it's not a sprung rhythm. I mean, the cadences are based. The stresses fall within a metrical pattern, but it flows.
Yeah.
I mean, it flows in that kind of elemental way that obviously he intended. It's formally extremely accomplished, but when you try to if you were trying to render it in English, I would think that again and again that the trap you would fall into would be, you know, either overly formalizing it, I guess, if you were trying to correct, but more likely just falling again and again into prose and breaking it up into lines and never capturing that kind of hypnotic, dreamlike, constant flow that things like Wein und Brot have.
Yeah.
And I think something like that true also, I think, of Leopardi is the large periods, the way, the sort of the musical way in which he builds up, sometimes repetitions, but mostly the way he builds. They are, you know, his greatest poems are long poems, and
the syntactical fluidity and flexibility that he has, which usually gets ironed out in the English translations, where it, you know, the word order becomes much more prosaic.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, well, if you do it, if you get around to Sylvia, I look forward to it. As we're approaching the end here, I think we're approaching the end, and I was wondering, do you have within reach, though, a copy of, like, say, Without Mythologies, or?
Yes.
I was wondering if I could. I know you're going to think this is kind of odd. It's a slightly long poem. I was wondering if I could get you to read one more, just because it's one that I'm fond of. It's on page 57. It's, well, you know, the Habla d'Auchor. That I mean, if memory serves, right? That's Guillaume Neuf, Duc d'Aquitaine, right? William the Ninth, right? Right. One. Yeah, one
this
of the famous.
This is a really old poem. I mean, it's from,
I know, but I like it because I take that line from a troubadour.
Like and I'll be glad to read it. I feel it's flawed, but I'll be glad to read it.
Well, I'll tell you why I like it, though, before you read it, is that there is a certain roughness to it that to my mind fits. I mean, it's a beautiful poem still, even if it's flawed, but what you might think of as flawed, I kind of feel as a kind of troubadour roughness to it. It reminds me of, because you take a line from William the Ninth, from, you know, William of Aquitaine.
Okay, Habla d'Auchor, which means simply in the sweetness. And the line from Guillaume Neuf is Habla d'Auchor del temps nouvel, in the sweetness
of the new time, or spring, you know, the primavera, you know.
Right. Habla dulcor. As the cypress stands over the weeping willow, not once thinking of laughter or grief, of rain or of the dream of rain, the forest of strangers returning to sleep. So I lay among women by olive groves. The moon cast their shadows on the sand as the waves rolled in against the shore. Habla dulcor, and in the sweetness of the new time. As the heart thirsts after the fountains of water, not once thinking of body or mind, of pain or of the dream of pain, the shaft of the huntsman being lodged in his side, so my heart thirsted after thee, O Lord. Calm was the day, and through the trembling air, the wind in the willows was sweet with thy word. Habla dulcor, and in the sweetness of the new time. As the nightingale sings to the forest of strangers, not once thinking of pity or fear, of fame or of the dream of fame, the sonnet traversing the tides of the years, so I sang from a chamber of the solitary tower. The exploits of heroes were sung in Provençal. The red-crossed knight, who was he? George. Habla dulcor, and in the sweetness of the new time. As the phoenix goes forth as a song from the pyre, not once thinking of darkness or light, of shame or of the dream of shame, the prayers of the body consumed in the night, so my songs went forth after thee, O Lord. The moon pulled my shadow into the world, as the word was made flesh, so the flesh was made word. Habla dulcor, and in the sweetness of the new time.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I guess to spare us both sore throats, I'll stop here. It's been a delight talking to you. I thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much for asking me, David, and it's been a tremendous pleasure talking to you.
I will say, well, what I will do is stop the recording, and then I'll say goodbye, but I will stop the recording here. And again, thanks. It was wonderful.
Thank you.